in archetype hand traps have gotten so freaking crazy. Humans of the cardboard, welcome back to Just Nuts, guys. Today, we are looking and talking about in-archetype hand traps, not just your generic ash blossoms of the world, but archetypes that are placed within specific themes that end up being searchable and extra accessible in those themes, and how they've kind of evolved. We've kind of been creeping up and boiling over at this point because you'll see at the end of this video, I've got 3 different, like, brand new, like, not even out yet in the TCG, hand traps on this list that when you read them, you're like, wow, this really is different. And we'll analyze that and go through it. We're going to go through a bunch of in-archetype hand traps that have already come out, but it's really, really evolved quite quickly. And I think this could be the future of Yu-Gi-Oh! Because I don't think the future of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is necessarily going to be, you know what, power creep Ash Blossom. Let's make a new Ash Blossom, but it destroys what it negates. Or make a stronger DD Crow, make a stronger Veil, or make a whatever. Like, I don't think that's the progression of Yu-Gi-Oh! Nibiru and stuff like that is kind of okay because I felt like Nibiru filled a very specific void that the hand traps didn't cover. It felt like a lot of the hand traps were just like 1-for-1 trades. We finally got one that can be like a legit threat to big combo decks, which was very needed. And so I'm okay when it fills a niche. I just don't want them to power creep everything. And so maybe the progression in that is making more archetypes that just have in-archetype hand traps that won't be just generically playable in any deck, but in their deck specifically, it helps them go second, but is also still just an inherent part of their engine. You'll see what I'm talking about. So let's start off with some of the older ones, some of the probably maybe the worst in-archetype hand trap of all time, Morgan the Enchantress of Avalon. There's 2 main things that I want to see when it comes to hand traps, in archetype specifically. First and foremost, is it searchable? Answer for this one, no. Doesn't have Noble Knight in the name. It has Noble Knight in the text, but I don't think there's any Noble Knight cards that search just anything that has Noble Knight in the text. And the second thing would be, can you use this without any setup on the field? Which essentially equates to, is this a good going second hand trap where, like, you don't have to set stuff up on your field prior, which means when your opponent's comboing off turn 1 and you're going second, can you use it to actually help hinder your opponent and give yourself an extra chance going second? Answer for this card, also no. So this card kind of misses the mark for sure. I remember when this came out, it was really cool, and I was like, whoa, that's so cool. Then, like, not searchable. It requires you to have a bunch of setup. Really, really bad card. Then we move to Subterra Fiendus. Still a great card to this day. Super, super searchable in the deck. But the problem is, of course, you need a face-up Subterra monster to resolve it. And that's kind of a bummer. I mean, it doesn't make it entirely awful going second, because all you have to do is normal summon a Guru or something, have this in the hand, and it does help you negate one thing to help you handle interruption better. But still, going second, I'd rather just be an Omni negate going second on their turn. Keep them off of the most important, whatever, choke point of their deck, which is pretty good. But still, good card, very searchable, so they can still be good in this situation, but like could have been better, right? Then we move to some of the other developments here, some trap cards. Zephyr War was interesting because almost every other trap card or every other hand trap on this list that needs a requirement from the engine on field, it's like a monster, right? Like you need a Subterra face up, you need a Noble Knights monster face up. Zephyr War was one of those first ones. It just needs scales, which is interesting because a lot of people will let you set up scales when you're playing Pendulum's going second because they know if they clear one or both of your scales, you could easily just have 2 more scales in the hand, 1 or 2 more scales, plop them down, and just play right through it. So nobody really wants to go after your scales until they know you definitely don't have more scales. So you can make this card live, fairly easily, even going second. But again, you'd rather it be live for their turn 1. Like, I just want to pop something on their turn 1, right? Like, that'd be really good. But I understand why it's not. You also move to Marine Cess Wave, kind of same thing. Like, you have to get all the way to a Link 3 to make this activatable going second. That's pretty brutal. That's why people play it at 1. If you could activate this way earlier, this card would be way more than a 1-up, especially since it's not once per turn. But because of that, it's just too slow. It's essentially just a brick, but still a necessary interruption you got to play in the deck. Moving on. This is a new kind of form of it. Here, the hand traps aren't actually hand traps, right? You have the Magical Musket cards, which are regular traps and quick play spells most of the time, and they don't actually make themselves hand traps, but the monsters in the archetypes have a continuous effect that say, While they're on the field, you can activate all your musket cards straight from the hand. So that means quick play spells on the opponent's turn without setting them. Same thing with traps. It makes for a really interesting control deck where they can almost function like a back row deck, but you never have to set anything. So you don't lose to the evenly matches of the world. You don't lose to lightning storms of the world, right? All these giant Harpy's Feather Dust, so these giant board breaking, just back row clearing cards that would normally punish a back row deck, which is really cool. You're weaker to other things, right? Like any negation for your monster on the field could definitely screw you, but every deck's got a weakness, right? And you kind of see the same thing with Mr. Rune. It's the same exact thing, pretty much, except instead of a monster on field making your hand traps live, the field spell in the deck does the same thing. It just says you can activate the Mr. Runes straight from the hand on the opponent's turn instead of setting them. Again, another strategy that doesn't care about those pesky back row wiping cards, but has its own weakness. If they remove the field spell, you are in some trouble for sure. But still interesting. And this one's super new as well, but it works so similarly to the Musketeers that I kind of had to throw it here. Then we move to Earth's Arctics. Interesting one here. What I like about these is that they can trigger on the opponent's turn pretty easily, which is quite good. But the problem is that I think most of these need to be summoned. Let's see. If this card is special summoned while you control another Earth's Arctic monster, that's the problem. That means like and they all also tribute another high level monster from the hand. So you literally have to have like 4 of these in your hand. Summon one by tributing one, and then summon another by tributing another one. So you literally go through 4 cards just to get like 1 Book of Moon with Megatanus. Essentially, there are ways for them to get resources back. I'm not saying that's entirely what they do, but they just don't do it clean enough. Like, you lose resources for the most part when you interrupt your opponent that way, and that's not going to get it done. But I do kind of like the idea that they can kind of just fire. You know what I mean? They can fire off as long as it's as long as you've got a situation available for it. So it's pretty cool. Next up here, we move to the last of like the okay ones, which is this one, which is actually a pretty good one. It's Lady of the Labyrinth. We just got this revealed for Darkwing Blast. Very cool card for Labyrinth. It says in the same turn, not even in response, but in the same turn that either a normal trap card is activated or any Labyrinth monster in archetype activated its effect, this card can summon itself. Very, very cool. Very big body. It doesn't interrupt the opponent, but it is still a hand trap in the sense that like it can interrupt. But again, this is a card that is not really doing much going second aside from like a flipped Shade Brigandine, and then you can extend this card onto the field, but that's fewer and far between. But still a really cool card nonetheless. The ability to just play on the opponent's turn. We know how good that is. We know how much harder it makes it on your opponent to kind of like keep track of everything that's going on. So I like this card, but one, not an actual interruption. It's more of like a beater protection card with follow-up, abilities. But I like the way it summons. It doesn't even have to trigger. It just can activate at any time, which is really cool. And it's pretty free, so it's good. And now we move to the final 3. Okay, so first one here is R-Ace Impulse something. His name is something like that. Whatever. He's cool. His design is dope. But he is a really interesting hand trap monster. So he says, if your opponent activates a monster effect on the field, very common if you look at almost any deck that's good right now in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! This is super easy to obtain. He tributes himself from hand or field and then summons a Rescue Ace machine monster straight from the deck. Now, I will say this. As of right now, as far as the Rescue Ace monsters we have, I think we have 1 card not revealed. Could be another machine. We'll see. None of them are interruption, right? Like summoning any of them to your opponent's field is not interruption. There's one that says like if your opponent, I think it's if your opponent adds a card from deck to hand, you can draw 2 cards, which is not bad at all, for sure. But like still, you kind of gotta, your opponent will know it's up, and maybe it'll deter them from activating some cards, which still has value in and of itself, but still like not the best. But yeah, I love how this is just open-ended. Again, has no requirements for the field. It can just fire from hand as long as your opponent activates a monster effect on the field, and then just get you one of your really good archetype monsters. Hopefully down the line we'll get that monster to make this card way better, but I still like how good this one is. Doesn't need that requirement. It can fire second every single time, which is quite good. Next up, Tier Elements Havni. This card's coming out like this week, but I think it's kind of underrepresented in terms of how crazy this card could be. It just has almost like a hand trap. Because it says, in the hand, if your opponent activates a monster effect on field, kind of similar to the Rescue Ace guy, she summons herself, then mills 3. That's it. Like, super simple. But we know what that can mean in this deck. If you hit any other tier limit, it's going to trigger to give you a fusion summon, and she's already on field. So you've got 2 material to get into a Kaleido Heart, whatever. And if you're super lucky, you play something like Shadal's. You could just immediately fusion into a Winda on your opponent's turn, halfway through their play. We know how debilitating Winda can be, right? And there's other things too, like, I don't know. I don't know off the top of my head, but I know there's some other cards that they could definitely hit. They could hit something like a King of the Swamp, who could count as a specific material to make certain other extra deck monsters. You could potentially make like invoked monsters or Albaz monsters, depending on what you're playing. And there's definitely some really powerful implications behind this card. Now, it does need to hit. If you whiff, it's only a mill 3. It's not a mill 5 like some of the other effects, so the odds aren't as high as they could be. But still, in an archetype, hand trap, extender just helps you play, going second inherently in the deck, and I love that. That's what I want to see. So yeah, really, really great. And then we move to the final one, and this one has to be super obvious. This is an entire archetype of DD Crows, but better. Because not only do they banish a monster from yours or your opponent's graveyard, and if your opponent controls a monster, it's a quick effect, but they also summon themselves. They banish that monster to summon themselves like chaos monsters, and then they offer you more value. You've got like a way to search any monster, any dragon monster on end phase, which is crazy. You've got a way to get extra removal, and you have ways to like Foolish Burial your in-archetype cards, which is so crazy. So I think this engine is kind of like the epitome of like seeing more power creep in hand trapping. Like, this is just like if Earth's Arctics were like not super minus, right? Like if the Earth's Arctics didn't need to like tribute a monster from hand and didn't need to have another Earth's Arctic on field to trigger their effects to interrupt, and they were just like all big chungus hand traps that just jump on the field on your opponent's turn, then it'd be awesome, right? But unfortunately they don't, and like that's kind of their biggest downfall at this point. But we have something like Bisted now, and this is not only really, really powerful and really, really good at going second, but also really splashable. There's no restrictions on these guys, so I would be okay with seeing more restrictions on things, just kind of like the R-Ace guy, where like if you would play him in a deck, you would also have to play probably a Bricky Machine R-Ace monster that would be used as the interruption. Whereas if you're just playing it in its own archetype, you'd just already be playing that card, so it's not even a brick. You're not even playing extra bricks or anything. And so I think that's the incentive here at the end of the day, is they would make in-archetype hand traps that really are smooth and feel right in your own archetype, but like aren't stupid and like bricky once you or like are stupid and bricky when you sell them in other decks. Because I don't think Konami wants everything to be splashable. They like making their splashable engines from time to time. We know that it sells money, it makes them a ton of money. They want to do it, but I do think for the whole, I mean, we get like 20 plus archetypes, new archetypes every single year. Right? So there's going to be some where they're going to want to do some things like more in archetype hand traps, I believe. And I hope that's the route where we get these kind of hand traps where like Havni and Rescue Ace guy can just kind of be an inherent hand trap going second and like just give the deck a little extra leg up when it comes to playing losing the die roll, and still give you a good chance to like slow your opponent down before you get to play without just having to play 10, 15, 18 hand traps in your main deck. So I don't know, just some thoughts from me. In archetype hand traps are crazy. I like it though. I like it, especially when they're archetype locked and they're not great in other archetypes. And I hope to see more of it, because we're so used to the standard archetype of like your monsters are just monsters. They get on the field and they do their thing. And then there's these generic hand traps. Why can't there be a crossover of like have it be part of the archetype more often here? Because I think that's just the natural progression, right? But I don't know. Those are just my thoughts there. Really interesting topic. I want to know what you guys think. Where do you see the progression of in-archetype hand traps going? Where do you see it going? Also, where do you want to see it go? Because I'm sure there's a lot of archetypes that already exist that would love to get their own in-archetype hand trap, assuming it works in a favorable manner, synergistically with like the way that deck already works. But yeah. But that's it for me today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. As always, subscribe to the channel if you have not yet and you want to see more sexy content like this. And also, follow me on Twitter. Peace.